Tonight we journey into a forgotten world, one of the most grueling, dangerous, and soul-crushing jobs of 19th century Britain. Picture yourself awakening long before dawn, the air thick with smoke and the scent of boiling fats, your hands raw and blistered from hours of labor. You are not a baker, you are not a miner, you are a soap maker, an essential but overlooked trade that keeps the wheels of Victorian hygiene turning. This is the untold story of Samuel Whitaker, a soap worker in 1885 Liverpool, a city drowning in grime, disease, and relentless industry. Feel the sting of lye on your skin, breathe the heavy stench of tallow in the air, and witness the brutal price paid by the working class to keep Britain's cities from collapsing under their own filth. Grab your tea, settle in, take a deep breath, and let's travel back in time together. The clock strikes 11, as Samuel Whitaker's eyes snap open. The pale moonlight filters through the thin, yellowed curtains of his cramped lodging on Sparrow Lane, slicing the small room into slivers of cold light and heavy shadow. The bitter wind howls through the cracks in the wooden window frame, rattling it like skeletal fingers tapping on glass. His thin woolen blanket offers little warmth, and the coarse, straw-stuffed mattress beneath him feels harder with each restless night spent upon it. His body aches, not from sleep but from the torment of yesterday's shift. Muscles still tight, fingers still raw. The acrid scent of tallow seems permanently embedded in his skin. He swings his legs off the mattress, his bare feet touching the icy floorboards, sending a jolt of cold up his spine. Every movement feels like dragging chains behind him. The room holds little beyond his threadbare clothing, a dented tin mug and a faded photograph of his late wife and their young daughter, who now live with his sister in the countryside. His earnings barely support them, but at least it keeps them away from the choking filth of the city. There is no breakfast. There hasn't been for weeks. His stomach grumbles, a familiar and constant companion. Hunger gnaws at him, but the promise of leftover trimmings at the factory will have to suffice later. As he pulls on his patched wool trousers and coarse linen shirt, the fabric brushes over the chemical burns that speckle his forearms like angry red stars. The lye has eaten into his flesh over the years, leaving behind scars that no salve can soothe. The streets of Liverpool are eerily still at this hour, save for the occasional flicker of gas lamps casting their jaundiced glow onto the rain-slicked cobblestones. Samuel walks quickly, head down, as the wind tears at his thin coat. The scent of coal smoke, whetstone, and decaying refuse fills his nostrils. The gutters overflow with the runoff of industry, a cocktail of waste from textile mills, shipyards, slaughterhouses, and tanneries that feed the insatiable appetite of the empire. As he passes a row of drunken sailors spilling out from the rusty anchor pub, their laughter echoes off the soot-stained brick walls, a mocking contrast to the work awaiting him. Samuel turns down an alley where rats scurry across his path, their tiny eyes gleaming in the dim light. He arrives at the grim facade of the Larkson Soap Works, a squat, soot-blackened building nestled between a tannery and a dye house, both of which emit their own nauseating odors. The factory's crooked smokestack belches a steady stream of black clouds into the night sky, joining the others that choke Liverpool's skyline like giant funeral pyres. Inside, the heat slaps him in the face the moment he opens the heavy wooden door. The furnace has been roaring for hours, and the air is thick with the heavy, greasy aroma of melting animal fats and caustic chemicals. His foreman, Mr. Hargrove, a stout man with a booming voice and a walrus mustache, stands by the main vat, barking orders to the other workers. "You're late, Whitaker," Hargrove snaps without looking up, though Samuel is not late. This ritual accusation is as regular as the factory's bellows. "Apologies, sir," Samuel replies quietly, hanging his damp coat on a bent iron hook near the door. There is no point in arguing. Hargrove had been working in the trade since he was 12, and carried the authority of someone who knew every dark corner of the business, and its dangers. The soap works is alive with motion. Men heave wooden barrels of rendered tallow across the slick stone floor, their boots slipping occasionally on the greasy residue that never truly disappears no matter how much sawdust is spread. Other workers stir massive vats of boiling fats, their faces glistening with sweat despite the chill outside. The younger boys, apprentices barely old enough to be out of school, scurry like mice, fetching tools, sweeping piles of lye flakes, and avoiding the violent tempers of the older men. Hargrove points to the massive copper vat behind him. Today's batch needs 30 barrels, and we've got an order from the Duke's shipping fleet. No mistakes, Whitaker. You know what happens if we lose a contract. Samuel nods. The stakes are always high. One contaminated batch could cost the factory a fortune, and cost the men their jobs. Or worse. The Larkson Soap Works was already on the edge of financial collapse. Its competitors cutting corners ruthlessly with dangerous additives to produce cheaper soap that sold faster. He joins Peter Griggs, a man in his 40s with grizzled hair and a permanent limp from a fall into an empty lye pit years earlier. "Evening, Sam." Peter greets him with a weak smile as they begin hoisting the first barrel. "Evening, Peter," Samuel replies, bracing himself. Each barrel weighs close to 220 pounds, and lifting them requires all the strength left in his weary muscles. Together they heave the barrels onto the ramp, where they are tipped carefully into the copper vat, already steaming with partially rendered fat. The heat from the vat is overwhelming. Steam rises in thick waves, carrying with it the nauseating stench of boiling animal carcasses. The mixture bubbles like a living creature, spitting occasionally as pockets of trapped air escape. Samuel wipes the sweat from his brow with a sleeve, but it's a losing battle. His shirt clings to his skin, already soaked through. Beside them, a teenage boy named Edwin struggles to haul a sack of sodium carbonate, his thin frame barely managing the load. The chemical will be added next to neutralize the acids in the mixture, beginning the process of saponification that transforms fat into soap. "Easy there, lad," Peter calls, grabbing one end to steady the sack. Edwin flashes a grateful smile, his face flushed red from exertion and the heat. "First month and you're still standing," Peter adds with a chuckle. "You're doing better than most." The boy nods. "My uncle says hard work builds character." Peter's smile fades slightly. "It builds something, all right," he mutters under his breath, just loud enough for Samuel to hear. As the sodium carbonate is poured in, the mixture hisses violently, sending plumes of caustic vapor into the air. Samuel instinctively turns his face away, but the gas still stings his eyes and throat. The factory provided no protective gear, only handkerchiefs tied around the face, which offered little more than false comfort. They continue the brutal work for hours, stirring, measuring, adding precise amounts of lye flakes and adjusting the flames beneath the vat. The process requires constant attention. A single misstep can ruin an entire batch, or worse, cause an explosion. The combination of heat, fumes, and physical exhaustion wears on every man in the room. But the job is far from over. The hours dragged forward like a slow-turning millstone, grinding down both body and spirit, as Samuel and the others fought against the unrelenting tide of labor. The vat's contents churned and hissed as the saponification advanced, each bubble carrying with it a reminder of the delicate balance they struggled to maintain. Samuel's arms screamed in protest every time he pushed the heavy wooden paddle through the thickening mixture. His fingers were blistered beneath his gloves, thin leather offering little protection from the intense heat and corrosive chemicals. The steam that rose from the vat clung to his face and clothes, soaking them in sweat and grease until every movement felt like wading through syrup. The factory, though modest in size, held within it a brutal microcosm of industrial Britain. Men who worked themselves toward an early grave to feed their families, boys who traded childhoods for survival, and overseers who balanced the fine line between cruelty and desperation, knowing that a single shipment rejected could shutter their fragile business entirely. Larkson Soap Works was not the largest factory in Liverpool, nor the most modern. It was old, its machinery outdated and patched with makeshift repairs. The copper vats had long since lost their shine, their greenish stains betraying years of corrosion from the volatile contents within. In the corner of the room stood Mr. Langley, the plant's accountant, a thin, pale man with sunken eyes, whose sharp gaze swept across the floor with hawk-like vigilance. Though he never lifted a single barrel or stirred a single batch, his presence loomed heavy over every worker. It was Langley who calculated wages, who docked pay for the smallest perceived infractions, and who quietly negotiated with suppliers for cheaper ingredients when the owners demanded higher profits. His leather-bound ledger was more feared than any blade, for it could reduce a man's livelihood with the stroke of a pen. As midnight slipped into the early morning hours, Samuel's back throbbed as though burning coals were lodged between his vertebrae. The repetitive motion of stirring, lifting, and hauling wore down his resolve like water-carving stone. The acrid fog in the room grew denser with each passing hour, until even the gas lamps hanging from the beams overhead struggled to pierce the haze. Shadows flickered like restless phantoms across the walls, and the constant drone of the furnace bellows provided a grim soundtrack to their toil. Peter, ever the voice of bitter humor, coughed harshly and muttered, "Feels like the devil himself hired us to boil his stew tonight." Samuel managed a weak chuckle but did not slow his work. His hands moved instinctively, muscles operating from memory even as his mind wandered toward thoughts of his family. He pictured his daughter, Alice, her face illuminated by morning light back at his sister's cottage, far from the grime and pestilence of the city. She was 8 now, with a mischievous smile that mirrored her late mother's. Every coin he earned here was sent to keep her safe and fed. Every hour spent inhaling the poisonous vapors bought her another day away from this life. At the far end of the room, Edwin struggled again, this time with a barrel of lye. The sack slipped as he attempted to balance it on a dolly, causing its contents to spill in a white, dusty plume. Instantly, the lye burned through the damp air, eating at the boy's exposed skin as he recoiled in panic. Peter was quick to act, grabbing a bucket of vinegar kept nearby precisely for such emergencies, dousing Edwin's arms to neutralize the burn. The boy whimpered as the chemical sting gave way to the harsh relief of the acid bath. "Easy, lad," Peter whispered, patting Edwin's shoulder as he wiped away the mixture. "You'll live. We all get our first burn sooner or later. It's the ones after that you stop feeling." Samuel's stomach twisted as he watched the boy nod, his eyes wide with both fear and shame. These factories devoured innocence as readily as they consumed tallow and caustic soda. Edwin would be lucky if this was his worst injury. Others had fallen into vats or been caught in the gears of the crude mixers, their screams echoing through the factory until they were silenced by either rescue or death. The night's monotony was briefly interrupted when the factory door creaked open, and the cold night air rushed inside, swirling the dense vapors into strange patterns. In stepped Mr. Larkson himself, the factory's owner, flanked by 2 men Samuel had never seen before. The owner's rotund frame and well-tailored suit stood in stark contrast to the grime-covered workers. His face wore the smug satisfaction of a man who profited from the suffering of others while never touching the product that earned him his wealth. "Gentlemen," Larkson announced, his voice cutting sharply through the din, "allow me to introduce Mr. Pembroke and Mr. Stanley from the Consolidated Hygiene Syndicate. They've expressed interest in a potential partnership." Samuel froze. The syndicate was known throughout the trade for aggressive expansion, buying out smaller operations and replacing traditional methods with cheaper, faster processes that prioritized profit above all else. Workers at other syndicate-owned factories whispered of adulterated ingredients, ground chalk, cheap lard substitutes, even hazardous fillers, all to stretch production while undermining quality and safety. "We're exploring opportunities," Larkson continued, "to modernize and increase efficiency. Of course, this would mean some changes to our methods." His eyes swept over the workers, landing briefly on Samuel before flicking away as if even the act of seeing them was beneath him. Pembroke, a tall, thin man with spectacles perched precariously on the end of his nose, stepped forward. "Progress demands sacrifice, gentlemen," he declared with rehearsed enthusiasm. "Our proprietary formulas allow us to produce soap at half the cost, while meeting the growing demand of an expanding empire. Surely you can appreciate the necessity of adapting." Stanley, shorter and rounder, added with a chuckle, "After all, what's a pinch of chalk or a drop of substitute oil in the grand scheme? The public doesn't know, and the margins are excellent." The workers exchanged uneasy glances. The unspoken truth hung heavy in the air. Any partnership with the syndicate would likely mean layoffs, pay cuts, or worse, the introduction of practices that would endanger not just their jobs, but their consciences. Samuel's jaw clenched as his mind raced. Was this to be their future? Had they not already given enough? Larkson clapped his hands, his face alight with false cheer. Let's return to business, shall we? Tonight's batch won't stir itself. The visitors retreated to Larkson's office, their voices fading behind the thick door as the workers resumed their tasks in heavy silence. The hope that had carried Samuel through countless nights now felt thinner, more fragile, like a single thread fraying with every pass of the paddle through the steaming, toxic mixture. As the door to the office closed behind Larkson and his guests, the oppressive silence in the main production hall returned like a weighted blanket, pressing against every man's chest. The brief glimpse of the syndicate's representatives had unsettled the workers more than any injury or chemical burn ever could. The men exchanged sidelong glances, wordless acknowledgments of a shared anxiety they dared not voice too loudly. In this world, whispers could cost a man his position, and positions were the only thing standing between their families and the merciless claws of poverty. The night crept forward, as though time itself was exhausted. The endless cycle of stirring, lifting, and blending continued with mechanical precision. Samuel's arms were numb now, not from relief, but from pure overuse, the muscles so taxed that his brain could no longer fully register their constant distress. The physical pain had dulled, but the gnawing weight in his chest, that blend of fear, helplessness, and suppressed rage, only intensified. The soap mixture had reached the crucial stage, full saponification. The thick paste-like substance rolled sluggishly as Samuel and Peter methodically stirred it to prevent scorching at the vat's bottom. The air was almost unbreathable now, saturated with vaporized alkalis, acidic fumes, and the foul essence of slaughterhouse byproducts. Even with their makeshift cloth masks tied tightly across their faces, the men's eyes burned, their lungs rasped, and their skin itched from invisible chemical particulates that clung to their every pore. Peter finally broke the oppressive quiet. "You reckon he'll sell us off?" His voice was low, nearly swallowed by the bubbling mixture. Samuel didn't answer immediately. He knew exactly what Peter meant. If Larkson sold to the syndicate, their futures would hang in the balance. Entire shifts had been terminated after such takeovers elsewhere. Those who remained often found themselves handling far more dangerous concoctions for even less pay. And those who objected, well, they simply vanished from the payroll entirely. "I don't know," Samuel replied finally, his voice hoarse. "But he didn't bring them here to admire the brickwork." Peter grunted, shifting his weight to ease the constant ache in his crooked leg. "Aye, and men like Larkson don't host polite visitors at this hour unless there's silver involved." In the corner, Edwin was bent over, sweeping piles of dried soap flakes that had spilled from the cooling racks earlier. The boy's thin frame shook with each breath, his youthful lungs struggling against the caustic air. Samuel watched him, a familiar protective instinct rising within him. Edwin was too young for this place, too small to be throwing bags of caustic soda or inhaling lye dust. But youth had never protected anyone here. The city's factories devoured boys as easily as they consumed men. Without lifting his head, Edwin spoke softly. "Is it true, sir, that they put other things in the soap? That the other factories use poison?" Samuel hesitated. The boy's question pierced through the fog like a sudden beam of harsh light. In truth, poison was not the word the factory owners used. They called them improvers, stabilizers, or fillers. Words meant to soften the brutal reality that they were stretching product by adding substances that damaged skin, weakened soap quality, and sometimes endangered customers. "It's not poison," Peter answered before Samuel could speak. "But it isn't right either." Samuel glanced at Peter. The man's answer was carefully chosen, accurate enough to calm a frightened boy, but vague enough to protect both of them from any accusations of sowing dissent. Dissent had consequences. "The less you know about it, lad, the better," Peter continued gently. "You just keep your head down, work hard, and you might outlast most of us." Edwin nodded slowly, his wide eyes revealing the bitter resignation already settling into him like a second skin. The vat's contents were ready to be poured into the cooling molds now. Samuel and Peter moved to release the heavy iron spigot at the base of the vat, directing the thickened soap into long wooden trays lined up on metal carts. The liquid sloshed out in heavy, viscous waves, filling each tray with the creamy, pale mixture that would harden over the next several hours. Each filled tray was heavy, requiring both men to maneuver it carefully onto the rolling racks. If the soap splashed while still in this semi-liquid state, the scalding mixture could strip flesh from bone in seconds. There were no second chances here. One slip, one poorly balanced tray, and a man could be disfigured for life, assuming he survived at all. Once the pouring was complete, the vat itself had to be scraped down. Samuel gritted his teeth as he reached into the still warm copper vessel, using a long-handled paddle to loosen the sticky remnants clinging to the sides. The heat radiating from the metal felt like standing too close to an open flame, and the metallic taste of chemical vapor clung to the back of his throat. Peter worked beside him, both men too exhausted to speak now. Their world narrowed to the immediate tasks of survival. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the last of the residue was removed, and the vat sat empty. Samuel stepped back, wiping his forehead with a filthy sleeve, his breath ragged but steady. The hardest part of tonight's work was done, but many hours remained before they would see their cots again. The factory bell chimed faintly, signaling the approach of 4 in the morning. Outside, the streets would still be dark, but within a few hours Liverpool's markets would awaken. Merchants and shopkeepers would soon sell the hardened blocks of soap to households, bathhouses, and even hospitals. The very product born of this torment would be praised for its cleanliness, its fragrance masking the stench of sweat, blood, and chemical burn that birthed it. As Samuel stood there, his body sore and his eyes stinging, he heard movement behind him. Turning, he saw Mr. Langley emerging from the shadows like a ghost materializing from smoke. The accountant held his ever-present ledger, his thin lips pursed. "Whitaker," Langley said flatly, his tone devoid of warmth. "The owner wishes to see you before your shift concludes." Samuel's chest tightened. Being summoned directly by Larkson was rarely a sign of good fortune. Yet refusal was not an option. He nodded, exchanging a glance with Peter before following Langley toward the narrow staircase that led to the owner's office upstairs. The steps creaked beneath their weight as they ascended. The air grew less toxic, but not cleaner, merely stale. At the top of the stairs, Langley knocked once before opening the heavy oak door. Inside, the office was warm, lit by oil lamps that gave the room a yellow glow. The scent of fine cigars lingered in the air, mixing incongruously with the faint chemical aroma that permeated everything in the building. Mr. Larkson sat behind a grand mahogany desk, his hands folded over his ample stomach. The 2 syndicate men sat nearby, sipping from glasses of brandy like guests at a dinner party, rather than men discussing the fate of dozens of livelihoods. "Ah, Whitaker," Larkson smiled, though it did not reach his eyes. "Come in. We have much to discuss." Samuel stepped forward, his heart pounding, aware that whatever was about to be said could alter the course of his life entirely. The room radiated a warmth that was both physical and psychological, designed to soothe guests and project an illusion of control, success, and comfort. Thick curtains blocked out the world beyond the glass panes, as if the filth of Liverpool itself had been banished at the office door. The brass clock on the wall ticked with steady precision, its pendulum slicing the silence like a metronome of fate. Samuel stood rigid near the desk, his calloused hands clasped behind his back, the acidic scent of his sweat clashing with the rich aroma of aged brandy and expensive tobacco. Larkson gestured lazily toward an empty chair before his desk. "Sit, Whitaker, sit. No need to stand like a soldier." His voice was honeyed, but the glint behind his eyes remained sharp. Samuel hesitated only briefly before obeying, lowering himself onto the hard wooden seat while keeping his posture straight, resisting the urge to slouch under the weight of exhaustion and apprehension. Pembroke leaned forward slightly, studying Samuel like a merchant inspecting livestock at the market. "You've been here, 7 years now?" His voice carried the polished smoothness of a man who rarely dirtied his hands but held sway over those who did. "8, sir," Samuel corrected, his voice even. His throat was dry, but he dared not request water. "8," Pembroke repeated with a nod, as if mentally jotting down the figure. A model worker, according to Mr. Langley's records. Reliable, skilled, seldom absent. That's rare these days. Stanley chuckled softly, swirling the amber liquid in his glass. Indeed, most men break under this kind of labor far sooner. You've got strong bones, Whitaker. Samuel said nothing. Compliments from such men were rarely sincere. More often they were tools of manipulation, baited hooks disguised as praise. He waited for the real purpose of this meeting to reveal itself, as it surely would. Larkson cleared his throat and folded his hands. The gentlemen from the syndicate have made a most generous offer, one that will ensure the future of Larkson Soapworks and, by extension, the future of men like yourself. Samuel's jaw tensed slightly, but his face remained composed. What kind of offer, sir? Pembroke answered smoothly. The syndicate intends to modernize your operation, improved efficiency, lower costs, larger distribution. With our proprietary formulas and supply chain networks, this factory could double its output within a year. And the workers? Samuel asked carefully, his voice calm but firm. Stanley leaned forward now, his voice dropping into a tone meant to suggest confidentiality. Naturally, some adjustments will be necessary. Fewer hands may be needed once the new systems are installed. But men of your experience, men who have proven their loyalty, could find themselves promoted. Overseers, supervisors. Samuel's stomach tightened. Overseer, a foreman's position, perhaps marginally better pay, but at what cost? To rise by stepping on the backs of men who would be discarded? To supervise the very process that would poison the soap with chalk fillers, ground bone ash, and inferior fats, all in the name of profit? Larkson sensed his hesitation and smiled, as if reading his thoughts. Think of your daughter Whitaker. A secure income. No more endless nights hunched over vats. A proper home. Schooling for the girl. Your sacrifice could ensure her future. The mention of Alice struck like a hammer blow. Samuel pictured her thin face, her bright eyes, her small hands gripping the letters he managed to send when time and money allowed. The dream of giving her a life away from this misery was what kept him moving through every shift, every ache, every breath of poison. And if I refuse, sir? Samuel asked, his voice quieter now, though no less steady. Larkson's smile cooled and his eyes narrowed almost imperceptibly. Refusal, Whitaker? No one is being forced into anything, but industries evolve, and those who fail to evolve with them often find themselves left behind. Pembroke added quickly, We believe in rewarding loyalty, Mr. Whitaker. Your foreman, Mr. Hargrove, has already expressed interest in remaining after the transition. You could stand beside him, leading this factory into a new era. The word loyalty twisted in Samuel's gut like a blade. Loyalty to whom? To the men who risk their lives every night? To the factory that saw them as expendable? To the syndicate that peddled deception as progress? Langley, who had remained silent until now, finally spoke, his voice oily. You'll have a few days to consider. Of course, nothing will be finalized until the paperwork is complete. But I suggest you think carefully. Opportunities like this are not extended lightly. Samuel forced a polite nod, rising slowly from his chair. His legs felt heavy beneath him, but he refused to show weakness. Thank you, sir, he managed, though the words burned in his mouth like the fumes he inhaled each night. I'll give it thought. Larkson's smile returned wide and false. Excellent. That's all I ask. You're a smart man, Whitaker. I trust you'll make the right choice. Without another word, Samuel turned and left the office, Langley silently escorting him back down the narrow staircase. As the door shut behind him, the false warmth of the office vanished, replaced once more by the oppressive heat and choking air of the production floor. The rhythmic clanking of metal tools, the hissing of steam, and the low murmur of fatigued voices filled his ears. Peter spotted him immediately, reading the tension in Samuel's face before he reached the vats. Well? Peter asked quietly, eyes narrowing. Samuel shook his head slowly. They want to modernize, replace half the men, adulterate the product, Make me a supervisor to help them do it. Peter's mouth tightened into a grim line. Bastards. They're offering security, Samuel added bitterly. For me, not for everyone else. That's how they work. Peter's voice was low, careful. Cut one deal to secure a few, leave the rest to rot. Samuel exhaled slowly, glancing across the floor. He saw Edwin dragging another sack of soda ash toward the next mixing station, his small frame straining under the weight. Around them, dozens of men labored through the haze, their faces slick with sweat, their eyes hollowed by years of sacrifice. Men who had taught him the trade when he was barely out of boyhood himself. Men who had shared food when wages ran thin. Men who had lifted each other from the floor when accidents struck. Could he be the man who stood aside while the rest were discarded? Could he climb a ladder built from the broken bodies of his brothers? Samuel's mind reeled as his body resumed the motions of work. But now each movement felt heavier. The paddle in his hand seemed weighed down not by soap, but by the burden of the choice placed before him. The morning bell was still hours away, but the night had already grown far darker. The hours that followed crawled by in agonizing increments, each minute dragging its feet like a reluctant prisoner. The factory's rhythm remained unchanged. Barrels rolled, vats boiled, men sweated and strained. But for Samuel, every familiar motion now carried a sharp edge. Every breath drawn from the acrid air weighed heavier upon his chest. The conversation in Larkson's office replayed relentlessly inside his mind, circling like a vulture waiting to feast upon his conscience. The words opportunity and loyalty had been dangled before him like poisoned bait, and though his hands worked the paddle, his thoughts were elsewhere, torn between survival and betrayal. The factory bell chimed 6 sharp notes, signaling the first rays of dawn creeping over Liverpool's horizon. Outside, the city stirred to life. Market carts rolled along the cobblestones, chimney sweeps gathered for their first rounds, and the port's cranes reached skyward like giant skeletal fingers. But within the walls of Larkson Soapworks there was no sunrise, only the same heavy gloom lit by dim gas lamps flickering against soot-stained brick. Peter limped beside Samuel, dragging an empty barrel toward the back wall for cleaning. His breath came in wheezing bursts, the years of inhaling caustic vapors having whittled his lungs into fragile paper. "You'll have to decide soon," he rasped, his voice barely rising above the constant bubbling of the vats. "They won't wait long." Samuel nodded grimly, glancing at the younger men nearby. Edwin was among them, stacking cooled soap blocks onto iron carts for delivery, his thin arms shaking under the weight of each slab. Further down the line, old Reggie scraped hardened residue from the cooling molds, his once sturdy back now permanently stooped from years bent over his labor. "This place won't survive them," Peter continued, lowering his voice further. "Not once the syndicate takes over. You've seen what they did at the Eldridge Works. Replaced half the men with boys too desperate to refuse any wage. The rest thrown out like rotten scraps." Samuel's stomach twisted. He remembered the rumors, how Eldridge's soap output had doubled in months, but at the price of ruthless efficiency. They had introduced new chemical shortcuts, cheap fillers that made the soap feel smooth but stripped moisture from the skin, causing rashes, sores, and worse. Complaints were dismissed. Poor families bought the soap because it was cheap and the syndicate's profits soared. "I can't stop them, Peter," Samuel admitted, his voice tight. "I'm just one man. They've already made their decision." Peter's eyes narrowed. "You're not powerless. You've got the ear of the men. They respect you. If you stand against it, maybe others will too." Samuel shook his head, wiping sweat from his brow. "And risk being blacklisted? If I speak out, I lose everything. Alice, my sister, their cottage, gone overnight." Peter was silent for a long moment, his gaze distant. "Sometimes," he whispered, "it's not about what you can afford to lose. It's about what you can't afford to become." The words struck Samuel like a hammer blow. The choice laid before him was not simply one of promotion or poverty, it was a test of his very soul. To accept the syndicate's offer was to climb higher by stepping on the faces of the desperate. To refuse was to embrace uncertainty, risking everything for a principle the world cared little for. The weight of that decision bore down upon him as the morning shift bled into cleanup, each motion now fueled by nothing but pure habit. As the bell tolled again, signaling the end of the shift, the workers began filing toward the factory doors, their faces pale and slick with sweat, their steps unsteady. Some muttered goodbyes, others walked in exhausted silence, their shoulders slumped beneath invisible burdens. Outside, the early morning sun glinted off rain-slicked streets as the city of Liverpool fully awakened. Samuel remained behind a moment longer, standing in the middle of the production floor, surrounded by the fumes that had become as familiar to him as breath itself. He stared at the empty vats, the rows of cooling trays, the barrels stacked neatly against the far wall. This was his world, a world of blistered skin, raw lungs, and chemical burns, a world that now hung by a single fragile thread. Finally, he turned and made his way out into the open air, the sharp contrast of cold, clean wind biting at his damp skin. The factory loomed behind him, its crooked smokestack billowing black clouds into the pale sky like a permanent scar on the city's face. The streets bustled with activity, dock workers hauling crates, street vendors shouting prices, carriages rattling along uneven stones. Life continued, indifferent to the agonies of men like him. As he walked the familiar route toward his lodging, Samuel's legs ached beneath him, each step heavier than the last. The distant cries of seagulls mixed with the clatter of horseshoes, the stench of fish markets blending with chimney smoke in the thick morning air. He passed rows of narrow brick houses where washing lines fluttered between windows and hungry children peered from behind rain-streaked glass. Turning a corner, he paused outside a small post office where a thin envelope waited for him, a letter from his sister. He tore it open carefully, scanning her neat handwriting. Alice's cough has eased some with the change of air. She asks about you every evening before bed. We pray for you each night, Sam. Your wages have kept us fed and clothed. I cannot thank you enough. Samuel's throat tightened as his eyes traced each word. The cost of failure was not just his own suffering, but theirs as well. His choice would not only determine his fate, but theirs too. He tucked the letter into his coat pocket and resumed his walk, finally reaching the crumbling brick building where his rented room awaited him. The narrow staircase groaned under his weight as he climbed to the third floor, unlocking the warped door to his tiny, dim chamber. The weak morning sunlight filtered through threadbare curtains, casting pale stripes across the sagging bed. Collapsing onto the mattress, Samuel let his eyes close, the exhaustion washing over him like a tidal wave. Yet sleep did not come easily. The syndicate's offer haunted him like a shadow behind his eyelids, twisting and turning with every labored breath. Outside, the world roared on, indifferent. Inside, Samuel lay trapped, between survival and conscience, between duty and betrayal. The war within him was only beginning. The few hours Samuel spent on the straw-stuffed mattress were shallow and restless, his body too broken for true sleep, his mind too tangled in knots of impossible decisions. The faint sounds of the bustling city seeped through the thin walls, vendors crying out prices, carriage wheels clattering on cobblestone, distant whistles from dock workers signaling deliveries. But none of it reached him deeply. His mind wandered endlessly, circling the conversation in Larkson's office like a noose tightening with each repetition. Every promised benefit the syndicate offered seemed to grow more grotesque under the harsh light of memory. They weren't opportunities. They were bribes. And every bribe left someone else to suffer. When the distant toll of the evening bell echoed faintly, signaling another shift's beginning, Samuel's eyes opened automatically, his muscles moving before his brain even registered the motion. The cycle was too ingrained now. There was no question of skipping the shift, no luxury of hesitation. Rent still needed to be paid, and his family still needed what little he sent. Survival never allowed for rest, only for brief moments of collapse. He washed quickly in the cracked basin, the cold water shocking his raw skin as always. The burns on his forearms were healing poorly. patches of red and blistered flesh ringed by the irritated edges of older scars. He barely felt them anymore. The ache had long since become part of him, like the heavy air in his lungs or the ceaseless hunger in his belly. Pulling on his work clothes, still damp from the previous shift, he tied the cloth mask around his face and stepped back into the choking fog of Liverpool's streets. The journey back to Larkson Soapworks felt different tonight. The factory's looming shadow stood heavier against the gaslit streets, as though its bricks carried the weight of the coming change. The syndicate's influence had not yet officially arrived, but its presence could be felt in the air like the distant rumble of an approaching storm. As Samuel entered the building, the familiar wave of suffocating heat and acrid chemical fumes washed over him. The vats were already lit, the fires stoked, and the first batches of animal fats bubbled ominously. The men moved like shades through the haze, bent figures of sweat, soot, and quiet suffering. Peter greeted him with a silent nod, the lines around his eyes deeper than before, his breath rattling faintly from his ruined lungs. Tonight, however, there was a different energy. The whispers had begun. Near the back of the production hall, huddled beneath one of the storage platforms, a small group of men spoke in hushed tones between tasks. Samuel recognized the faces: Wallace, the tall barrel hauler with a miner's build; Tomlin, whose clever fingers could repair any of the factory's battered machinery; and young Curtis, barely 16, wide-eyed but fierce beneath the grime of long shifts. They fell silent as Samuel approached, unsure of whether he could be trusted. Wallace broke the quiet first. "We heard," he muttered, his voice low but steady. "About the syndicate, about what they're planning." Samuel's jaw tightened, but he nodded once, not bothering to deny it. "They'll gut us," Tomlin said bitterly, casting a glance around to ensure no overseers lurked nearby. "Same as Eldridge, same as the Stanton works. Half the men gone, the rest handling barrels twice as heavy for half the pay." Curtis added with a trace of anger beneath his fear. "And filling the soap with rubbish that burns your skin raw. I've seen my sister's arms blister from that garbage." Samuel inhaled deeply through the cloth over his mouth. "I don't disagree," he whispered. "But speaking openly like this, if Larkson or Langley hear of it—" "We know the risk," Wallace interrupted. "But we also know what happens if we stay silent. This isn't a negotiation. They'll make their changes whether we nod or not." There was a pause, the weight of that reality sinking into all of them like a stone into a deep pool. Samuel's throat was dry as he spoke again. "And what do you propose?" Tomlin leaned closer, his voice barely audible beneath the hiss of the boiling vats. "We've been speaking to some of the other shifts. The men at the Stanton Works tried to resist too late. We won't make the same mistake. If we stand together, before the contracts are signed, before the machines arrive, there's a chance. But we need leadership." Curtis's eyes flicked nervously to Samuel. "They'd listen to you." The words hit like a hammer blow. Samuel felt his breath catch for a moment, his pulse quickening. Him, the reluctant leader, the one who'd always just kept his head down, doing his work, surviving another night. Now these men, his brothers in suffering, were looking to him to become the voice of resistance against the very thing that threatened all their livelihoods. Against the men who'd offered him comfort and safety if only he would abandon the others. Peter approached quietly, his limp making his steps nearly soundless over the greasy floor. He had overheard enough of the conversation to understand. "They're right," he said softly, his eyes locking with Samuel's. "You have their respect, Sam. You've earned it. They'll follow you." Samuel closed his eyes for a brief moment. Every part of him screamed for caution, for self-preservation, but beneath that primal instinct was something else. That faint ember of dignity that had somehow survived years of degradation. That part of him that remembered his father's voice long ago, before the accident at the rail yard had crushed his bones. "A man's worth isn't measured by what he earns, son. It's measured by what he stands for when it costs him." When Samuel opened his eyes, they were steady. His voice was quiet, but carried a firmness none of them had heard from him before. "Then we don't wait. We gather the others. All of them, across every shift. Wallace nodded, determination replacing fear in his expression. Tonight? Samuel nodded. Tonight. The group dispersed quickly, vanishing into the steam and shadows, returning to their tasks for now, but with new fire burning beneath their exhaustion. The decision had been made. They would not go quietly. As Samuel returned to the mixing station, he felt the weight on his chest shift slightly, not lighter but different. No longer paralyzed by indecision, but heavy with the knowledge that what came next would be dangerous, perhaps even fatal to their livelihoods. Yet for the first time in weeks he did not feel entirely powerless. The night would continue, as it always did. The fires would burn, the vats would bubble, and the city outside would remain blind to the silent battle brewing inside Larkson Soapworks. But within the factory's choking walls, the first embers of rebellion had been lit. The following nights unfolded with an intensity that seemed to blur the boundary between exhaustion and determination. Each shift became not only a battle against boiling vats, scalding chemicals, and searing heat, but also against the creeping dread of discovery. Samuel moved through the factory like a man carrying two invisible burdens: the physical labor that had always defined his existence, and now the weight of organizing resistance under the watchful eyes of Langley and the overseers. Every whispered conversation, every cautious glance exchanged in the corners of the production hall carried the risk of exposure. Yet, slowly, the whispers multiplied. Word spread carefully, carried by trusted voices to the men who had labored side by side for years. The older hands, hardened by decades of toil, understood what was at stake with grim clarity. They remembered the fates of the Eldridge and Stanton works, where entire families were left destitute overnight. The younger men, like Curtis and Edwin, clung to the movement with a mixture of fear and defiance, their youthful energy igniting a courage that surprised even themselves. The syndicate's promise of modernity meant their fathers would be replaced, their brothers discarded, and eventually themselves consumed like coal in the factory furnace. Peter, despite his frail lungs and failing leg, proved invaluable. His years of quiet observation had earned him the confidence of men across every shift. With his guidance, the message spread like a carefully controlled flame, hot enough to grow, but hidden well enough to avoid detection. "We act as one, or we fall as one," Peter would whisper to each man who joined, and every nod of agreement added another link to the fragile but growing chain of solidarity. Samuel found himself becoming something he never intended, a leader not through ambition but through necessity. His nights, once filled only with the dull repetition of labor, now carried the electric tension of secret plans whispered between tasks. Strategies were formed in stolen minutes: how to approach Larkson as a unified body, how to present their demands without being immediately crushed under the syndicate's boot. The risk was enormous. If Larkson sensed open rebellion too soon, he would call in replacements by the dozen, firing every man who dared to speak. But if they waited too long, the contracts would be signed, and the syndicate's grip would be irreversible. One night, beneath the cover of thick steam rising from the freshly poured vats, Samuel called a quiet meeting near the far loading docks where deliveries of soda ash and tallow arrived. The men gathered in twos and threes, their breath ghosting in the cool night air, faces pale under flickering lantern light. Over 20 workers stood in that hidden corner, more than half the night shift, and more promised they would bring others before the week was out. Samuel stepped forward, his voice steady though his pulse hammered in his throat. "You all know why we're here," he began. "We have built this factory with our hands and backs. Without us, there is no Larkson Soapworks. Without us, there are no profits for Larkson or for the syndicate." His gaze moved across the crowd, meeting tired but resolute eyes. "But if they take over, they will discard most of us like waste. They will poison the soap we produce, not just with chalk and fillers, but with the ruin of our dignity. I will not be the man who helps them do it." Low murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd. Wallace, towering in the back, crossed his arms and added, "They think we'll break like dogs begging for scraps. They're wrong." Samuel continued, "This cannot be a riot. We cannot give them excuse to call in constables or crush us under force. But if we present a single voice, every man standing together, we force their hand. They either listen or face losing their entire workforce overnight. No syndicate can replace skilled men in one day. What if they fire us all? Curtis asked, his young voice trembling but firm. What if they close the factory entirely? That risk is real, Samuel admitted. But I believe they will not. This factory isn't ready for full syndicate control. They need us to finish the Duke's shipping contract first. That buys us time. Tomlin, the mechanic, nodded. We hold the line until that contract is fulfilled. They'll hesitate before cutting us loose in the middle of a royal commission. Peter stepped forward beside Samuel. But no man stands alone. If any one of us falters, the rest suffer. We act together. Or not at all. Silence hung heavy for a moment. And then Wallace spoke again. When do we present the demands? Samuel drew a deep breath, knowing this was the moment they had all been walking toward. Tomorrow night, before the shift begins, we meet here, every man who will stand with us. Then we approach Larkson as one body. A murmur of assent passed through the gathered men. They knew the danger. They knew the price if it failed. Yet in that moment, as steam hissed and chemical smoke curled into the night sky, their collective resolve was forged like iron. As the men dispersed into the shadows, returning to their stations, Samuel remained behind for a moment longer. Peter stayed with him, his breathing shallow, but his eyes sharp. "You're sure?" Peter asked softly. "No," Samuel admitted, "but I can't carry the weight of doing nothing." Peter placed a hand on Samuel's shoulder, squeezing gently. "Then that's enough." The next day dawned under a slate-colored sky, heavy clouds hanging low over Liverpool's skyline. The city was alive as always, bustling carts, shouting merchants, the calls of gulls circling the busy harbor. But within Larkson Soapworks, the air was thicker than usual, charged with a silent electricity that buzzed beneath every glance and motion. Langley passed through the production hall as usual, his ledger clutched like a weapon, his sharp eyes scanning the workers with suspicion. Whether he sensed the undercurrent of unrest was unclear, but he paused longer at each station, studying faces for hints of disloyalty. Samuel worked as he always had, his paddle stirring the thickening mixture with practiced rhythm. Yet his mind raced ahead, counting hours, calculating risks. Tonight would decide everything. Night fell upon Liverpool like a thick, suffocating curtain, draping the narrow alleys and brick corridors in a dense fog that smelled of rain, coal smoke, and distant sea salt. The lamps along the waterfront flickered like pale stars against the gloom, while the towering chimneys of factories spat dark plumes into the already heavy air. In the belly of the city, beneath the skeletal timbers of Larkson Soapworks, the men gathered as agreed. No words were spoken as they arrived, slipping one by one into the concealed corner by the loading docks, the usual whispers replaced now by a solemn unity. The entire night shift had come. Nearly 60 men, hardened by years of labor, their faces etched with lines of exhaustion and fear, but also with the unmistakable determination of those who have been pushed too far. Samuel stood at the front, flanked by Peter and Wallace. His heart hammered in his chest, but his face remained steady, the responsibility of what was to come anchoring him with a strange and unfamiliar calm. He could feel the eyes of the others upon him, their trust a weight heavier than any barrel he had ever lifted. These were men who had worked beside him in the heat and smoke, who had bled on the factory floor beside him, who had offered what little they had when one of their own fell ill or injured, and now they stood together, their fates intertwined like the thick ropes that lashed cargo in the harbor. Peter's voice, barely above a whisper, cut through the thick silence. "We do this as planned. Calm. Steady. We speak as one." Samuel nodded, drawing in a slow breath that tasted of damp stone and oil. "Let's go." Together they moved as a single body, emerging from the shadows like a rising tide. Their boots struck the stone floor in unison, the soft rhythm echoing faintly through the cavernous production hall. The workers still stationed at their posts looked up with wide eyes as the silent column advanced, realizing instantly that something was different tonight. Even the constant hiss of the vats and the low groan of the machinery seemed to quiet as the men assembled at the center of the factory floor, forming a broad semicircle facing the stairwell that led up to Larkson's office. Langley appeared first, as if summoned by the unnatural stillness that had settled over the factory. His thin frame stiffened, and the ever-present ledger nearly slipped from his grasp as he scanned the mass of workers gathered before him. His voice cracked slightly as he spoke. "What is the meaning of this? Return to your stations. Immediately." No one moved. Langley's face paled as the tension mounted. He swallowed hard, his eyes darting toward the stairs. Mr. Larkson must be informed. Samuel stepped forward at last, his voice even and strong. "That's exactly who we've come to see." Langley hesitated for only a moment before turning sharply and ascending the creaking stairs with quick, uneven steps, disappearing behind the heavy office door. A muffled conversation could be heard above, voices rising and falling urgently, though no words carried down clearly. Moments later, the door reopened, and Larkson himself emerged, his face a mask of forced composure. Behind him, Pembroke and Stanley followed like vultures drawn by the scent of fresh opportunity, both wearing thin smiles that barely disguised their unease. Larkson descended the staircase slowly, his hand gripping the polished railing. His eyes swept across the sea of grim faces before him. "Gentlemen," he began, his voice deliberately calm, "is there a problem?" Samuel met his gaze, his own voice steady. "There is, and we've come to resolve it." Larkson's smile tightened. "I see. And who speaks for this assembly?" "I do," Samuel answered. For a moment, nothing moved. Then Larkson exhaled through his nose, glancing sideways at Pembroke and Stanley. "Very well, Mr. Whitaker. Speak." Samuel took another breath, his throat dry as parchment. "We know of the syndicate's offer. We know of the plans to replace our men, to poison the soap with cheap fillers that harm the very people who trust us to provide something clean and safe. We've seen what happened at Stanton and Eldridge." His voice rose slightly, strength building with every word. "We will not allow it here, not in this factory." Murmurs of agreement rippled softly behind him, dozens of voices lending silent weight to his words. Pembroke stepped forward, his voice polished, practiced. "You misunderstand, Mr. Whitaker. These are business decisions, necessary for modernization. Your loyalty has been noted, and there will be places for men like you." "There will be places for all of us," Samuel interrupted, his tone sharp. "Or there will be no factory. We stand together. If you replace one man, you lose all of us." Larkson's brow furrowed as he absorbed the bluntness of the ultimatum. His fingers drummed lightly against the staircase railing. "Are you threatening a strike?" Samuel shook his head. "We are promising it." For a few tense seconds, the world seemed to hold its breath. Even the distant creak of the factory roof beams went silent. Larkson's face reddened slightly as his composure cracked, but it was Pembroke who spoke next, his voice cold and clipped. "You're playing a dangerous game, Mr. Whitaker. The syndicate has resources. They will bring in new workers, new machinery. You'll be replaced before the end of the week." Peter's voice cut in now, rasping but strong. "You'll find no one willing to cross this floor. This city knows what the syndicate does to its workers. They won't risk it." Stanley sneered. "Foolish pride. Sentimentality doesn't keep factories running." "Neither does a workforce that walks out," Samuel countered. "Without us, this factory falls behind schedule. You won't fulfill the Duke's contract in time. That will cost you far more than honoring the men who have built this place." Larkson's expression darkened, but behind his eyes, calculations churned. The truth of Samuel's words was undeniable. The Duke's shipping contract was not merely profitable, it was political. Delays would ripple up through noble circles where patience for industrial squabbles was razor thin. His entire business reputation balanced precariously upon it. Pembroke whispered something into Larkson's ear. The owner listened, his jaw tightening, and then waved him off sharply. At last Larkson addressed the men once more. "You've made your position clear," he said slowly. "I will consider your demands. Return to your work for now. I will have an answer by week's end." Samuel held his ground. "We'll return to our work tonight, but if you bring in syndicate men tomorrow, we walk." The two men locked eyes for several heartbeats, and for the first time, Larkson blinked first. With a stiff nod, he turned sharply and ascended the stairs once more, his syndicate companions trailing behind. As the office door closed behind them, a wave of quiet relief washed through the gathered workers. The battle was not over, but for tonight, they had stood their ground, together. The hours following the confrontation unfolded beneath a strange and heavy quiet. The men returned to their workstations, each one resuming the same mechanical motions they had performed countless nights before. Stirring, pouring, hauling barrels, scraping hardened residue. Yet tonight, the factory floor felt different, as if it were holding its breath, waiting for the full weight of consequence to crash down upon them. The hiss of boiling vats and the rhythmic clatter of paddles echoed off the walls like distant thunder. The syndicate's threat still hovered like a blade suspended over their heads, but for now, it remained frozen in place, awaiting Larkson's next move. Samuel's muscles burned as he worked through the remainder of the shift, though his thoughts drifted far from the steaming mixture beneath his hands. The confrontation played again and again in his mind. Every word, every glance, every subtle twitch of Larkson's brow. Had he read Larkson's hesitation correctly? Had Pembroke's whispered counsel been ignored or merely postponed? The stakes had now outgrown him entirely. Dozens of men, their wives, their children, all stood precariously balanced upon his decisions. That knowledge weighed heavier than the barrels he had lifted for years. Peter worked nearby, his breath rattling as he scraped hardened soap from the cooling trays. Despite his labored breathing, his eyes remained sharp, watching Samuel with an understanding forged from years of quiet resilience. Peter had seen factories rise and fall. He had watched promises made and broken. Yet tonight, for the first time in many years, a different kind of flicker danced behind his sunken eyes. Hope. "They didn't throw us out tonight," Peter murmured under his breath, just loud enough for Samuel to hear over the roar of the boilers. "That's more than I expected," Samuel nodded, his voice low. "They didn't expect us to stand together. That caught them off guard." Peter chuckled softly, though his laughter was tinged with exhaustion. "You know what frightens men like Pembroke most? The thought that we've remembered our worth. That's something they can't bargain away." Samuel allowed himself a brief smile, though his mind refused to settle. The syndicate operated with patience. They would not forget tonight's defiance. Even if they backed away now, they would wait for a moment of weakness, for division to creep in among the ranks. Their victory would not come through force, but through the slow corrosion of unity. As the shift wound down, the factory bell tolled faintly, signaling the end of the night's labor. The men moved quietly toward the exits, their shoulders heavy with fatigue but buoyed by an unfamiliar sense of dignity. They exchanged nods and quiet words of solidarity as they stepped into the cold pre-dawn air. Even the bitter wind whipping through the streets of Liverpool seemed less cruel tonight. Outside, the city stirred with its usual rhythm. Market stalls opening beneath creaking awnings, dock workers unloading crates under watchful foremen, street vendors shouting over the clatter of iron-rimmed wheels. Life marched forward, indifferent to the silent war waged inside the factory walls. But for Samuel, each familiar sight now carried sharper meaning. These streets had always been harsh, but for the first time, he felt something beneath the surface, a quiet current of resistance. As he walked the familiar route back to his lodging, the tension that had lived inside his chest for weeks shifted once more, not vanishing, but transforming. What had once been a private dread had become something shared. The burden no longer rested solely on his shoulders. It belonged to all of them now. He paused briefly outside the post office where letters from his sister sometimes awaited him. But today, the small wooden box was empty. No new word from Alice. Perhaps no news was good news. He continued on, climbing the narrow stairs to his room. where the weak morning sun bled through the stained curtains like thin ribbons of gold. Collapsing onto his bed, Samuel allowed himself to sink into a sleep deeper than he had known in weeks. When he awoke, the sky outside had shifted from gray to leaden black once more. Night was falling again, dragging him back toward the inevitable return to the factory. But as Samuel dressed and stepped out into the lamplit streets, something was different in the air, an energy he couldn't quite place. The city hummed, but not with its usual indifference. Whispers followed him through the alleys and narrow walkways. Faces turned quickly away when he passed, but not out of hostility, out of caution. Near the factory gates, he found Peter waiting. The old man's face carried a rare expression, a grin that was both wary and excited. "What is it?" Samuel asked, his voice guarded. "They're talking, Sam, all across the district. What we did last night, it's spreading." Samuel's brows furrowed. Spreading how? Other factories, other floors, soapworks, textile mills, iron foundries. Men are hearing what happened here. Word's getting out that one shop stood up to the syndicate and wasn't crushed for it. Samuel's stomach turned slightly. The weight of his actions felt even heavier now. "That's dangerous talk, Peter." Peter nodded. "Aye. Dangerous, but necessary. Men have been waiting for someone to stand first. You gave them that." Before Samuel could respond, Langley appeared suddenly near the gate, his thin frame hunched as usual, ledger clutched tightly under one arm. His eyes darted between the two men like a bird nervously scanning for predators. But unlike his usual rigid posture, there was a strange unease in him tonight. Something unsettled beneath his habitual authority. "Mr. Whitaker," Langley said quietly, voice lacking its usual sharpness. "Mr. Larkson requests your presence. Immediately." Samuel's pulse quickened. "Has a decision been made?" Langley hesitated, the flicker of uncertainty flashing across his pale face. "I don't know. But they're waiting upstairs." Peter clapped Samuel gently on the back. "You've already faced them once. Go finish it." Samuel offered him a nod, his legs already moving toward the factory entrance. As he climbed the narrow stairs once more, the heavy oak door loomed ahead like the mouth of some great machine ready to devour him. But as he reached for the handle, he found his hand steady. Inside, the office glowed under the flicker of oil lamps. Larkson sat behind his desk, Pembroke and Stanley standing nearby, their postures rigid, their expressions unreadable. The air was thick with the unspoken tension of deals made behind closed doors. Larkson gestured calmly. "Sit, Mr. Whitaker. We have much to discuss." Samuel lowered himself into the chair once again, bracing for the words that would determine the future not just of his own life, but of every man who stood with him. The chair beneath Samuel creaked softly as he settled into it, the wood cool beneath his calloused hands. The air inside the office felt heavier than before, as though the smoke from Larkson's ever-burning cigar had thickened into something far denser, a mixture of power, money, and decisions that shaped the lives of men like him. The flickering lamplight cast long shadows across the polished surface of the desk, where neat stacks of paper waited, their tidy arrangements belying the storm brewing underneath. Larkson's face was composed, but his fingers drummed lightly on the desk's edge, betraying the agitation simmering beneath his veneer of control. Pembroke and Stanley flanked him like vultures on either side, their cold, calculating gazes fixed upon Samuel with unsettling calm. These were not men who dealt in sweat and labor. They dealt in ledgers, contracts, and lives reduced to columns of profit and loss. For a long moment, no one spoke. Finally, it was Larkson who broke the silence, his voice smooth but strained. "Mr. Whitaker, I've given your demonstration considerable thought." Samuel said nothing, allowing the man to continue. "You and your fellow workers have made your position abundantly clear. And while your methods were unorthodox, I will admit that your timing was precise. The Duke's contract cannot afford disruption, and your collective unity presents a very real obstacle to any immediate changes." Pembroke shifted slightly, the muscles along his jaw tightening as Larkson continued. "Under normal circumstances," Larkson said carefully, I would simply replace you all. Liverpool is full of desperate men willing to work for less. But the syndicate, as you must know, is not eager for public confrontations. They prefer smooth transitions, quiet takeovers. Stanley interjected now, his voice cold and clipped. You've created quite the dilemma, Mr. Whitaker, one that places this factory in an undesirable spotlight. Larkson raised a hand to silence his associate, his eyes never leaving Samuel's. But I am also a businessman, and I recognize when a temporary compromise is necessary to protect long-term interests. Samuel felt his pulse quicken, though his expression remained neutral. This was the heart of it. The tipping point. Larkson leaned forward slightly. Here is what I am prepared to offer. For the remainder of the Duke's contract, there will be no layoffs. The syndicate will not replace existing staff, nor introduce its proprietary formulas during this period. Your men will keep their positions. He paused briefly before continuing. However, once the contract is fulfilled, the transition to syndicate management will proceed. At that point, staffing decisions and production methods will be revisited. The words struck like a blow to the gut. Samuel had feared this, though part of him had hoped for more. A temporary reprieve, a stay of execution, but not a true victory. The weight of dozens of lives hung once more in the space between their gazes. Pembroke spoke again, his voice smooth as silk. It's more than fair, Mr. Whitaker. You've bought your men months of guaranteed work, time to prepare, time to save. Few would be given even that. Samuel's jaw clenched. And after that, you'll gut this place like the others. Stanley's thin smile returned. Progress always demands sacrifice. For a long moment, Samuel sat in silence, his mind racing through the implications. Months of work secured meant temporary safety for many families. Time to build what little savings they could. But it would not stop the storm that followed. The syndicate would still consume the factory eventually. Men would still be discarded. Families would still suffer. Larkson watched him closely. You forced my hand once, Mr. Whitaker. You won't do it again. This is the only compromise I'm offering. Samuel inhaled deeply. The embers inside him flared hot, but he swallowed them back, knowing the danger of speaking rashly now. He had never expected to destroy the syndicate in a single night, but perhaps buying time was, for now, the most he could achieve. I'll take your offer to the men, Samuel said finally, his voice even. Larkson's smile returned tight and thin. I thought you might see reason. But make no mistake, Samuel added, his eyes hardening as he rose from his chair. This fight isn't over, and when the syndicate returns, we will be ready. Larkson said nothing more as Samuel turned and walked toward the door. The syndicate men exchanged brief, unreadable glances, but no words passed between them. As Samuel closed the heavy door behind him, the faint click of the latch sounded strangely final. Peter was waiting for him at the bottom of the stairs. His eyes searched Samuel's face for answers before the question even left his lips. Well, Samuel exhaled slowly. They've given us months. No firings for now, but when the contract ends, they'll come for this place like they always do. Peter nodded slowly, his expression unreadable. Then we've won a battle, but not the war. Aye, Samuel agreed. But we've bought time, and time can be powerful if we use it well. By the time they stepped outside, the first light of dawn was beginning to creep across the city skyline, painting the chimneys and rooftops with soft bands of gray and pink. The wind carried the distant cries of seagulls and the low hum of ships preparing to depart from the docks. The men were already gathered beyond the factory gates, their tired faces turning toward Samuel as he approached. Word had spread quickly that he was meeting with the syndicate again. Now they waited for news, any news. Samuel stood before them, raising his voice just enough to carry across the crowd. We've won some ground. They won't replace us, not yet. No one loses their position while the Duke's order remains. We've forced them to back away, for now. A murmur rippled through the workers. Some nodded, relieved. Others frowned, understanding the temporary nature of the reprieve. But beneath it all ran a quiet current of pride. They had stood as one, and that unity had forced the syndicate to blink first. "But hear me well," Samuel continued. "This is not an ending. It's only the beginning. They will come again. And when they do, we'll be stronger. We will be ready." Peter stepped forward, resting a hand on Samuel's shoulder. "One night at a time, Sam," he whispered. "We've bought one night at a time." And so they dispersed once more into the waking streets of Liverpool, their boots striking the cobblestones, their breath visible in the cool morning air. The city swallowed them back into its endless rhythm of labor and survival. But beneath the smoke and grime, beneath the weight of industry and poverty, something had been planted. A quiet seed of defiance that would not be so easily crushed. Samuel looked skyward as the sun crept higher, his chest heavy but unbroken. They had faced the machine and lived to fight again. And in that small victory there was hope. As the first full rays of morning sunlight pierced the smoky veil above Liverpool, the streets filled once more with the endless rhythm of life. Carriages rattled across damp cobblestones. Vendors barked their morning prices. Factory bells rang out across neighborhoods where thousands of working souls prepared for another long day beneath the weight of industry. And yet inside one corner of this vast machine, at Larkson Soapworks, something fragile but powerful had shifted. Something that could not be seen on the surface, but pulsed underneath like a heartbeat refusing to stop. Samuel walked those familiar streets, his boots worn thin, his hands calloused and raw, but his shoulders no longer bent beneath the crushing helplessness that had once ruled his every breath. The men had stood together. They had bought time, not freedom, not victory, but time. And in an era where so many were chewed up by the gears of profit and power, even a single breath of dignity was worth fighting for. The days ahead would not be easy. The syndicate would return with its clever contracts, its polished men, and its endless patience. But now, Larkson Soapworks was no longer simply a factory. It was a line drawn in the soot and steam, a quiet promise that even among the poorest laborers, unity could carry power. And where power rises, change can eventually follow. And as Samuel finally returned to his small rented room, where the faintest breeze rattled the cracked window panes, he allowed himself, for the first time in months, to close his eyes and sleep deeply. Not the hollow, desperate sleep of exhaustion, but something closer to peace. Even if only for tonight, because tomorrow the fight would begin again, and they would be ready.